Okay, so let's unpack this. There is a specific image that comes to mind when most people think about the British government. It's not a spreadsheet. It's definitely not a sleek glass building.
Let me guess. It involves a lot of deep red leather, some very elaborate gold leaf, and people wearing robes that look like they've been borrowed from a period drama.
That is exactly the one, the House of Lords. It is, I mean, it's easily one of the most recognizable brands in global politics.
Hmm.
But, and this is a big but, the moment you stop looking at the aesthetics and actually start asking how it works, the answers get really fuzzy, really fast.
Hmm.
We're talking about a modern democracy that still has a room full of unelected people reviewing its laws. So the question we're diving into today seems incredibly simple, but, well, the sources we've pulled suggest it's actually a bit of a rabbit hole. Why do we even have a House of Lords?
It's the question that usually just gets answered with a shrug and the word tradition. But you're right, that's not enough. The sources we have for this deep dive suggest that if you want to understand what the Lord is actually doing, you have to strip away all the pageantry. Right. You have to ignore the robes for a second and just look at the engine.
But we really need to strip away the assumptions, too,
Yeah.
because I think most of us have a kind of default setting here. We see the robes and we think, okay, is this just a retirement home for ex-politicians?
Yeah.
Is it some elitist club designed to block the will of the people?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just, expensive theater that the UK keeps around for tourists.
And those are the hurdles we have to clear right at the start. The material is very specific on this. Constitutionally, the House of Lords is not there to run the country. And it certainly isn't there to block democracy. In fact, as we'll see, it really can't do that anymore.
So if it's not running the show and it's not blocking the show, what is the actual job description? Why are they clocking in?
The modern function is surprisingly technical. According to the analysis, the job is to review legislation, ask the awkward questions that got missed in the heat of a debate, and to act as a brake. It's about scrutiny. It's about forcing a pause.
A brake. I want to stick with that image because a brake implies friction. It implies slowing things down. But here's the problem I had when I started reading. To understand why we have a brake that looks like a medieval royal court, we can't just look at what it does now. The sources keep pointing us back to what they call the boring answer.
In constitutional history, the boring answer is almost always the right one. It explains everything.
It really does. We have to look at the origin story because that explains the shape of the thing. I mean, if you were building a democracy from scratch today, a startup country, would you design a legislature like this?
Oh, absolutely not. And that is the central insight here. The analysis in our stack emphasizes that Parliament wasn't designed at all. There was no founding fathers moment. There was no blueprint.
No meeting where everyone sat around a table with a blank sheet of paper.
Exactly. Let's have two chambers, one elected and one appointed, for checks and balances. It wasn't like that.
It wasn't a design. It was an accumulation. It feels more like a coral reef than a building.
That's a great analogy. It was a reflection of reality. If you go back to the early history, power wasn't in a voting booth. Power was, well, it was physical. It was land. It was the church. It was military force.
So you had the king, of course, then the nobility, the landowners, the barons, and the bishops. And eventually you had some representatives from the town starting to show up.
Exactly. And these groups didn't decide to sit in different rooms because of some high-minded theory. They sat where the power already was. The House of Lords wasn't created to be a secondary chamber. It was the room where the powerful people sat.
This was the part of the research that, honestly, it just stopped me in my tracks. I think we're so used to the modern setup that we view the House of Commons, the elected bit, as the main event, and the Lords as this weird appendage. But the sources point out a complete historical inversion.
Right. Historically, the House of Lords was the main event. It was the engine room.
And the Commons?
The Commons was the sidekick. Junior partner is the phrase the source uses. For a long, long time, it was the afterthought. It was basically there to sign off on taxes.
Wow.
So when we ask today, why does the Lords get a say? We're actually looking at it backwards. The historical question was much more like, why should ordinary people get a say as well?
That reframing it's wild. It completely changes how you critique the institution. It's like looking at an old skyscraper and realizing the lobby was originally the penthouse.
Precisely. And that context is crucial because it explains why the institution is shaped the way it is. It wasn't built for the people. It was a council for the powerful to negotiate with the king. But, and here's the pivot, once that junior partner started gaining real traction, the purpose of the Lords had to be justified differently.
Because eventually the money and the people were in the Commons. The power shifted.
Correct. So let's look at that. Before we get to the modern day, what was the Lords actually for back then? If it wasn't checking for typos in legislation, what was its value?
The source uses a really interesting word here. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about mood.
Yes, the distinction is fascinating. The theory developed that the House of Commons, because it was elected, reflected the mood of the country in the moment. It was immediate, it was
And
passionate.
potentially volatile. It was like the Twitter or X of the 18th century.
In a structural sense, yes. It reacted to popular pressure. If the public was angry, the Commons was angry. The House of Lords, on the other hand, was meant to embody continuity, stability, inherited responsibility. It was a check against sudden change.
So the Commons says, we want to do this crazy new thing right now. And the Lords is the institution that says, hang on, let's sleep on it. Maybe for a few decades.
Well, maybe not decades, but certainly a pause. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds incredibly archaic. This idea that a bunch of nobles know better than the people.
It sounds anti-democratic. Like they don't trust the public.
It is, by definition. But the source makes a really compelling argument that while we have rejected the nobles, part of that logic, the check on popularity part hasn't actually gone away. We call it something else now.
This was the bridge for me. This made it click. Because we still have institutions designed to be insulated from the mood of the moment, don't we?
We do. Think about the Supreme Court or the judiciary. We do not want judges deciding cases based on what's trending online. We want them insulated from the mob.
Or civil servants.
Exactly. The civil service stays when the government changes. They provide that continuity. Or look at central banks. They make decisions about interest rates that might be incredibly unpopular, but are seen as necessary for long-term survival.
So the argument is that you need one part of the system that isn't constantly checking its approval rating.
You need a part that isn't looking at the next election cycle. The language has changed. We talk about independence now, not nobility, but the underlying instinct is the same. Democracy needs a cooling mechanism.
That makes sense as a concept. So the Lords was the stability chamber. But obviously, something huge changed. Because if they were the main event and now they aren't, there was a shift. The source calls it the Great Shift.
And this is really the story of how democratic norms took over. As the idea that the people should actually be in charge strengthened, it became impossible to justify an unelected body having the final say.
Right, you can't have a bunch of dukes telling the people, no, you can't have that law indefinitely. Not if you want to keep your head attached to your shoulders, historically speaking.
Or at least keep your relevance. So over time, the real authority moved to the Commons. They became the wallet. But, and this is the key, the Lords didn't disappear. They lost power, but they kept influence.
I want to drill down on that because the source uses a very specific definition. It says the Lords shifted from being a co-equal holder of power to a constitutional break.
Yes. And we need to be very precise about what a break means here. It is not a veto. The Lords can't stop the Commons forever. It is a mechanism to ask the Commons to think again.
It's the "Are you sure?" button. You hit delete, and the computer pops up and says, "Are you really sure?"
That's a great way to put it. It's a pause. Are you sure you want to word it this way? Have you considered the implications for this group? This seems rushed.
And the source notes this wasn't one big revolution. It wasn't a singular moment of reform.
No, it was gradual. It was the compromise people could live with. You keep the fancy robes, you keep the pageantry, but you strip away the ability to block the budget. You change the job description.
Which brings us to the accidental house of expertise. Because once you take away their power, what's the excuse for keeping them around? You can't just say because they own land anymore.
Exactly, that doesn't fly. So the justification had to shift again. If they aren't there because of status, why are they there? The answer became experience.
The house of expertise. And looking at who's actually in there now, it's not just aristocrats anymore. It's a strange mix.
It is. You have people who've run major government departments, drafted laws themselves. You have leaders of huge charities, scientists, business leaders, doctors.
It's like a super panel of consultants.
And here's the irony. The system wasn't rebuilt to be a technical chamber. We didn't sit down and say, we need a chamber of experts, let's go recruit them.
Right, there was no LinkedIn search.
Yeah, it grew into that role. It is an accidental solution. The prime minister appoints people, often for political reasons, but the result is a chamber that happens to have this deep reservoir of technical knowledge.
That is so incredibly British, isn't it? We have this room full of people. What should we do with them? Oh, let's just ask them for advice.
Essentially, yes, and that leads directly to why it feels so awkward today.
Okay, let's get into the awkwardness.
Sure.
Because even with the expertise argument, it still feels tense. There's always this friction between the commons and the lords. Why is that?
It's the mismatch between the structure and the job. We're asking the lords to do a very modern job scrutiny, revision, detailed review, but we're asking them to do it using a structure that's hundreds of years old.
It's like trying to run modern software on a computer from the 1980s. It might work, but it's going to be glitchy.
And because the structure is so outdated, the source points out that the whole system relies heavily on convention.
Convention.
Mm.
That is a word that comes up a lot. It sounds like a polite suggestion.
It's stronger than a suggestion, but weaker than a law. It basically means doing the right thing because that's how we do things. It relies on self-restraint. It relies on good faith.
So it assumes everyone is going to behave like a gentleman, basically.
Yes, and that makes the institution feel fragile to modernize. Because if you have a system that relies on people behaving nicely rather than on hard-coded rules, what happens when people stop behaving nicely?
That's the scary part. It feels like a handshake deal in a world of ironclad contracts.
It does. And the source notes this reliance on behavior makes it hard to explain. You end up doing a lot of hand-waving. Well, they are unelected, but they don't really use their power usually unless they really have to.
Just trust us, it works.
Most of the time, it sort of does, but it works because of that slow evolution we talked about.
Right.
Because the people in the room generally agree on the unwritten rules of the game.
So let's recap that journey. We started with power.
Power and authority. The lords as the dominant force.
And then we moved to restraint.
The break. Influence rather than dominance.
And finally, we moved from inherited status to
accumulated experience, from who your father was to what you've done.
And the source concludes that this wasn't accidental, but it wasn't planned either. It's an adaptation.
Exactly. It wasn't meant to do what it does now, but what it does now is a direct result of surviving through centuries of change. It found a niche. Its niche is scrutiny.
But, and there's always a but, the source teases us with a really big question. We've talked about how the Lords acts as a brake, but, let's be real, can't the Commons just ignore them?
That is the ultimate question. If push comes to shove, yes. The Commons can force things through using the Parliament Acts. They can overrule the Lords.
So why do they bother? If the Commons has the nuclear option, isn't the brake just an illusion?
Not quite. Because using that option takes time, it burns political capital, it looks bad. And often, by the time the Commons could force it through, the public mood has shifted, or the press has picked up on the flaws the Lords pointed out. The power isn't in blocking, it's in the delay.
It forces the debate to happen in the daylight.
Precisely. But it does bring us back to that fragility you mentioned.
It does. And this is the provocative thought I want to leave the listener with, which comes straight from the source. We live in a polarized era. Political norms are being tested everywhere.
Right. We're seeing a shift from, is this proper, to just, is this illegal? If it isn't strictly illegal, people will do it.
So if you have a major institution of government that relies entirely on good faith and gentlemen's agreements rather than hard rules, is that viable anymore? Does a system built on a handshake work in a world that increasingly demands a fist fight?
That is the question. If the conventions crumble, the institution might not be able to justify itself anymore. It only works as long as everyone agrees to make it work.
That is a slightly terrifying thought to end on, but a really important one. It's not just about tradition, it's about whether the old ways can survive the new mood.
It is the ultimate test of the break.
Well, on that note, we will leave you to ponder the fragility of unwritten rules. Thanks for diving deep with us today into the weird, wonderful, and accidental history of the House of Lords.
It was a pleasure.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.